So I have a medical background, and a certification I rarely use, though I keep going back and paying to renew it. Anyhow, I volunteered almost immediately, thinking I would help those who have lived through Hurricane Katrina. But it turned out that that was not the case. There were a few of us who were assigned once the water started to recede, to find houses that had dead bodies in them. If you've ever had to do a body recovery when it has been lying around in the heat and the water for days, sometimes weeks at a time, you know how it smells. It does sort of smell like any other dead carcass, but much worse. I can't explain it. Maybe somehow sweeter smelling. Anyway, the key to not vomiting when you smell them is Vicks. In, under, and around the bottom of your nose. It doesn't keep all the smell out, but enough until you can at least tolerate it without vomiting. We had to go into each house in wading boots and look for bodies. Many of them washed out to sea, but some were still in the houses they had lived in prior to the hurricane. If we did find a body, we'd spray painted a big X on the outside of the house. This other guy and I had been doing it for a while, and we got assigned to each other almost every day. We got along okay, and he didn't vomit at the ones that had been gotten to, but one day we came up to this one old shack. I say shack because it was pretty run down, in what had been a very bad neighborhood. Right away I got chills down my spine. I knew there was something really wrong. Not like finding a body kind of wrong, but chilling kind of wrong. New Orleans has certain areas that just give off these vibes, and my understanding is there is a lot of voodoo practice in certain areas. So against everything my body was screaming at me, we went in the house. The first thing I could smell was a body. The second was something almost earthy and mouldy. I looked at my partner. I'll call him Jay. He was as white as a sheet. I could tell he was getting that same feeling I had been getting. It was obvious from the weird bones hanging from the ceiling. I would bet money they were cats. But something odd had been going down in the house, as well as strange beads and carvings in the bare wood in the walls. We went into what was a kitchen, and there, chained to a beam, was an old lady, or at least what was left of her. She had chained herself by her wrists to the beam, and her guts were falling out onto the floor. The creepiest thing was her face, though. She still looked as though she were alive and staring at us with a wicked smile, showing only partial teeth. My skin started crawling as the goosebumps spread over my body and my neck hair stood up. Suddenly, I heard the most unearthly cackling noise I have ever heard in my life, and my fight or flight kicked in. Jay and I noped out of there, quickly painted the X on the outside, and literally ran to the next house. Now I don't know if that old lady had practiced voodoo or whatever, but that scared me so much, and it still gives me nightmares now. The people I feel sorry for are the ones who had to take that crazy lady out of there. Jay and I discussed it that night after we went back to the hotels north of there. He had heard the cackling too, but we both said it had to have been the wind or something. This story is not a piece of fiction. It's absolutely real. Real as the trees, rivers, me, you. Perhaps that's what makes it more terrifying. Before starting the story, I want to give you a bit of perspective about where I lived, my locality and my neighbours. It all happened a long time ago when I was just a 10-year-old kid. I lived in my mum and dad's house at the time, and it was a big house with trees surrounding it on all sides. We lived in the city, but somehow the environment felt very serene and peaceful, unlike the noisy, crowded and polluted scenarios you expect in a city. The locality consisted of 5 families including us, and all the houses were adjacent to one another, so the neighbours were always at beck and call for each other. Amongst all the neighbouring families, there was one family which always stood out, but for no particular reason. They were the professors. They were called so because almost all of them were professors. This story is about an incident which happened concerning them. The professors consisted of 5 members: Mr. John, a reputed professor of a college I can't name here, and who was teaching there for the last 45 years without ever taking leave. He was known as a strict outside, gentle inside kind of teacher. He would give you the harshest of punishments, but if you cannot understand anything or fail to attend classes due to important reasons, he would teach you until you had your doubts cleared, no matter how much time it took to do so. For this reason, he was loved by his students, despite having an anti-hero personality. Next was his wife, Mrs. Jessica, also a professor of said college. She is the type of teacher that you cannot hate. Sweet, caring, and motherly. She made everyone love her, no matter how much he tried to feel otherwise. Following them were Mr. James, John's much younger brother, and Mrs. Olivia, his wife. Both were professors at different private colleges, and both seemed really nice and simple, particularly James, who I didn't think I have ever seen not smiling. No matter who the person is, whether a colleague or the trash collector, James addressed everyone with that calm and gleeful smile. Final member of the family was Dolores, John and James's sister. She was not a professor like the other members, not even normal, according to the other neighbors. She had suffered from mental problems since she was a teenager, having been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, which resulted from the trauma of her mother passing away when she was 14. Every night the neighbors, including me, could hear her loud grunts, moans, and cries, which ultimately stopped after 15 minutes or so. The family at first stood out because of Dolores herself. Many neighbors believed that Dolores was not mentally retarded, but was actually possessed, as every night it took a cleansing to calm her down, and that her grunts, moans, and cries are actually the demon speaking, not Dolores. However, the validity of these claims are up for question. Now that you guys have gained a little perspective, let me start the story. It all started when suddenly I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't remember if it was because of a nightmare or not, but I remember that I was sweating and panting heavily. It was a dark, cold December night, but somehow it was not stagnant and silent as one would expect such a night to be. I could hear mumblings and mutterings of multiple people outside on the street, which was strange considering how late it was. Me being a kid then got scared and anxious of this whole ordeal and ran frantically to go to my parents and tell them about this entire situation. But, much to my surprise, they were nowhere to be found. Scared and thinking about terrible outcomes, I began crying loudly and running all throughout the house, looking for my missing parents, when I, by chance, found out that the main door was not locked. Gathering all my leftover strength, I went out the door to see a small gathering of about 10 to 20 people on the street, closed in a huddle, all of them whispering among one another. At the back of this gathering were my mum and dad. They were trying to get in front of the crowd to get a better view of something. As soon as I figured out that they were my parents, I ran towards them and hugged my father from behind, tears still running down my cheeks. My father, though shocked at first seeing me cry, consoled me, wiped my tears, and put me atop his shoulders, my favourite ride. It was then when I saw what all the ruckus was about. It was dark, but I could clearly figure out a man lying face up with his eyes closed. I was a kid, so it was pretty weird for me seeing a man sleeping in the middle of the road. So I asked my father, why was this man lying in the middle of the street? He didn't reply, but told us that we all should return back to the house and go to sleep, as it was pretty late. As we were about to head back, we were stopped in our tracks by what was the most terrifying scream I have ever heard. A scream that gave me nightmares for a week after. I was pretty afraid and confused by that time as to what was happening then. I saw many people head inside the house, as did my parents, after telling me to stay there and wait for them. But as a curious boy who never listens to anyone, it was a difficult order to comply to. and I secretly followed them inside the house. The house itself was not that big, being a 2-story, but I saw everyone heading for the roof, the source of the screams. The roof had a small kutcher house, from where the smoke was coming out, along with the screams. The neighbours broke down the door as it was locked from inside, and as it opened, I saw what I can only describe as the stuff of nightmares. Inside the house was a woman of around 50 years of age, on fire, with her lower body burnt so badly that there was no flesh remaining. Her muscles were being burned to expose the bones within. Her face in utter anguish and pain. Those expressions I can never forget. She ran around the house frantically, as if to escape the wrath of the fire that was burning her alive. I saw muscles fall off her body as she was running, like a well-cooked piece of chicken that melts in your mouth. I couldn't take it anymore, and ran from there as fast as I could. I felt like vomiting. That smell of burnt flesh lingering on my nose, making me nauseous. I ran straight inside my house and into my room, not even waiting for my parents. I couldn't sleep properly for the remainder of the night. The screams and her face working as nightmares and disturbing my sleep incessantly. The next day I expected my parents to be serious and gloomy because of what had happened the night before, but they were behaving normally, almost as if nothing had happened. Perhaps it was to help me forget about what happened the night before and lighten the mood, and it worked. I was able to forget everything in a couple of weeks. It was after many years, once I was an adult, that my parents told me the entire story. That night, Mr. John committed suicide. He jumped from the roof of his house and ended his life. But his suicide was in no way normal. Firstly, he was found facing upwards on the ground. It was a pretty strange position to be in when you are committing suicide. Usually those who die of suicide from jumping from a great height are found face down on the ground. Secondly, there was little to no amounts of blood flowing from his body. How is it possible to have such low amounts of blood from a fall which killed you? Which brings me to the third point. As I mentioned before, the house was only 2 stories high. Jumping from its roof can break bones, but it's not so high that you can die on impact. So how could it have killed Mr. John? These questions were never answered, but many of the neighbours suspected Dolores of killing her brother due to a psychotic episode, and then killed herself by setting herself on fire due to the guilt and grief of her actions. But these are mere speculations. At present, the professors still live in that house, and grunts and moans are still heard at night. The only difference is that it's now Jessica who makes those noises, apparently having gone mad from the grief of losing her husband. All things aside, I cannot help but exclaim how similar these noises are to that made by Dolores when she was alive. The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a murderer, later confirmed, when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, and we were very naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible, so we walked far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just become dark. It was twilight, when all of a sudden, my boyfriend, who has 20/20 vision, saw a man slowly approaching us. It seemed he was creeping up on us. At first we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire, so I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him, nor did he have any camping equipment, just a drawstring bag on his back. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no source of light. He sped up after my boyfriend called out, and he came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. It was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off loudly at this point. When my boyfriend realized it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife, and he made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us, like he'd had a sudden realization. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if you were all having a party." Now remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and he just had a drawstring bag on his back. After he'd asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers, but we asked him what was going on. He didn't answer this. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant the guy approaching us couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people have you got with you?" Then he began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now just to note, we had set up our camp on this really steep hill, as it was the only spot for miles that was possible to set up. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. Then he proceeded to walk off in a direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Also, he had no light and no camping gear. Nothing. We were silent and listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill, completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds. Then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him as it was so dark. At this point I was freaking out, but I didn't want to seem like a pussy in front of my boyfriend. We had a talk about whether we needed to leave, and my boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to him, I should run. At this point I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said we needed to get out of there and to just grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. He seemed to be the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to very quickly walk down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at us at one point, so he ran directly behind me to protect me. This experience has stuck with me, and I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason as to why that guy was there that night. This was at the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night, so I decided to type into Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time, and there had. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He'd behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her, though somehow she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realized this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We were lucky, as it could have been us. When I was 18, I was in a severely abusive relationship. No one knew it from the outside, but my boyfriend at the time was a monster. We had just spent the evening at my grandmother's house, handing out candy with her. I didn't want him there, but he insisted he go everywhere I did because he was immensely controlling. After we'd finished up with the trick-or-treaters, he told me he wanted to go to a neighbouring town to see a movie. I had no choice but to agree, so off we went, and he decided he would drive my parents' new vehicle. I was not feeling particularly happy to be spending more time with him, so he started prodding me. He began to fight with me, and I told him I didn't want to do this anymore. He sat calmly at a turning section, then jerked the wheel quickly and put my side of the car into oncoming traffic. We were almost immediately T-boned. I remember seeing a car coming at me and screaming, then I was knocked unconscious. The car had caught fire and he had left me in the vehicle to presumably burn. He didn't even call 911. We were about 2 kilometers from my parents' rural house, and they had seen the commotion of fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, etc., so they ventured out to see what was happening. I regained consciousness and started panicking upon seeing the smoke coming from the car. I was so dazed, but I was also on the verge of an anxiety attack. At this point, I remember hearing a woman's voice saying, "Shh, it's okay, you're okay. Your mum is going to be here soon." I turned and there were 2 older women with white hair and were dressed in white, sitting in the back seat of the car. I had not seen either of them before, and for a town of a couple of 100 people, that was surprising. Everyone literally knew everyone. One lady didn't speak to me, but the other kept soothing and reassuring me. She handed me a white blanket and covered my lap and hands. I instantly calmed down, and the next time I regained consciousness, my mother had climbed into the driver's seat and was yelling at me to wake up and asking me what had happened. I was taken by ambulance to the hospital, but I groggily told my mother about the women and gave her the blanket. She went to one of the cops on scene and asked to meet the women and to thank them. He looked at her, puzzled, and said that he was the first one at the scene. He also said there's no way 2 elderly women could have gotten into the back seat of the vehicle. My mum kept the blanket, and she still has it in her cedar chest to this day, and we haven't talked about it since. At the time of this story, I was a 16-year-old in high school. I got a babysitting job for a couple who had a family wedding and needed a babysitter for what was going to be a super late night. I was referred to them by another family I used to sit for, and keep in mind that this was when cell phones were just coming out, so I had a really crappy flip phone with a certain amount of minutes. There were 3 kids altogether. The oldest was a boy about 8, another boy about 6, and a little girl who was a toddler in diapers and couldn't say a word. I arrived while the sun was still up and to meet the kids while the parents were still there. The parents were really cool. They showed me where all the snacks were and gave me the ground rules for the night. Kids in bed by 7:30, teeth brushed, you know the drill. Once they'd left, we started off by eating dinner, and to my shock, the middle child, who we'll call Teddy, kept throwing his fork with hard force at his siblings and pinching his sister with his nails under the table. He kept kicking my shins and throwing his food around the room. The moment his parents left, he became a terror. Their house was old but had been remodeled, so their toys were in the basement playroom. So after dinner we all went into the basement to play. As soon as we went down the stairs, it felt strange. Don't get me wrong, it was a beautifully finished basement with a couch, flat screen and toys, but something just felt creepy about it. Then the little girl kept pointing at a blank wall, one with no pictures or anything on it, and kept screaming at the top of her lungs and crying. It really unnerved me, and at this point I'm getting a really bad feeling, so I say, "Let's go upstairs and watch TV till bedtime." The kids seemed to love that idea, so I carried the little girl upstairs and turned on the TV for the 3 of them and went back down to grab her favourite stuffed dog and clean up a bit. When I turned around to walk back upstairs, I see Teddy smiling a sickening smile at the top of the stairs as he has his hands on the light switch. My stomach dropped. I didn't have my phone or a light if this little tyke decided to lock me down here. The light switch is at the top of the stairs outside the stairway, so if he closed that door, I was screwed. Suddenly he flicks the lights off, cackles, and goes to slam the door and lock me in the dark basement. I've never moved so fast in my existence. I flew up those stairs and shoved my hand in the door to keep him from locking me down there. I asked him why he did that and yelled at him to never do it again, and all he did was smile at me, then slowly walk away, giggling. I iced my hand and watched him closely for the rest of the night. Finally, bedtime comes around and I put the kids to bed upstairs without any problems. There were 3 bedrooms, parents' room at the end of the long hall, then the baby girl's room in the middle, and the boys shared a room with a bunk bed at the end of the hall by the top of the stairs. Everything finally seemed quiet, and I began to forget the horrors from earlier and began watching TV. About an hour after I had put her down, the baby girl started screaming again through the baby monitor, a scream that sounded like she was in pain. Thinking that her brother, Teddy, is bothering her, I run up the stairs to stop him. But as soon as I get to the top of the stairs, I see him laying down on his bed, facing the wall. The baby is hysterical and is again pointing at nothing and crying. I am totally freaked out by now, and I rock the baby back to sleep, check on the boys, then return to the living room. What the hell is happening? Am I imagining things? I shake it off and turn the TV back on. Now this is when the night begins to go from bad to an absolute nightmare. Once back in the living room, I start to hear screaming every couple of minutes, but it was what sounded like a grown man screaming in pain. At first I thought it was outside, or maybe a TV or radio, so I ignored it and kept watching TV. Or maybe it was my imagination. Very soon it became clear it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't my imagination, but it was actually coming from inside the house. Then I heard the footsteps. I heard what sounded like little feet running around upstairs in the hallway. For a second, I'm not scared any longer. I'm now angry that Teddy's out of bed over 2 hours after bedtime. I go to the bottom of the stairs and holler up Teddy's name and tell him to go to bed. I don't hear a response, but I hear the footsteps continue. Then I hear what I think is him run into his parents' room at the other end of the hall. The sound of feet pounding down the hallway is as clear as day, so I run upstairs thinking I've caught him in the act. But the hall is empty and dark. I turn and find that Teddy is sitting up in his bed, staring at me again with that sickening smile. I could see his brother was asleep on the top bunk, and I could see his baby sister asleep on the monitor in my hand. He really gave me the creeps. I tell him to lie down and I go back downstairs to the middle floor. I then hear someone walking up from the basement. I totally lost it. I slammed and locked the basement door and I called my home number. My big brother answered and I tell him I'm really scared. He puts me on speaker and I explain everything that's been going on to my family. I babysit every weekend and I've never had a negative experience or called them like this, so luckily my family believed me. My grandpa, being a very religious man, prayed with me and calmed me down. My big brother got in his car to come and sit with me until the parents got home, but the town I was in was a bit of a drive, so he told me he'd be there in 40 minutes. Even after we hung up, I could hear the footsteps running around the house. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I sat on the couch and prayed and cried. I've never been so scared in all my life. The parents came home before my brother got there, and they could see I had been crying. They asked me what had happened, so I told them everything non-supernatural that had happened, because I didn't want them to think I was crazy, or tell people to not hire me. I just wasn't going to mention it at all. So I just said Teddy was a handful, and that was it. As I was leaving, the dad said in a dead serious voice, "Did the ghost bother you?" I slowly turned to him, not fully believing him. I asked him if he was being serious. He said, "Oh, I'm being serious. We've had a ghost problem for a while now. Did you experience anything yourself?" I just broke down and started crying. Then I gave them an honest recap of the night. I told them about the screams I'd heard clear as day, the footsteps and everything else. How the baby was crying at the wall and how Teddy tried locking me in the basement. They believed me right away. The parents said they'd moved into the house about 2 years ago after the old man who built the house had died inside of it. He was an actual hoarder and fell and injured himself in the basement and died among his piles of possessions, and since no one could hear him scream, they didn't find him in time. By all accounts from the neighborhood, he was a mean recluse of a man. Either way, what a terrible way to go. They said they would wake up every night to things flying off their kitchen counters and doors slamming. They would hear knocks and pounding in the walls. I was shocked. I asked why they stayed in the house if they knew it was haunted. They explained they weren't able to move due to their jobs and current financial situation. And I have to admit that although it wasn't huge, it was a beautifully built home. The old construction kind of home with bookshelves built in the walls and a winding grand staircase. The dad said that for the last year he would go downstairs every night and say, "Go away, this is our home now. You aren't welcome here," over and over. He said eventually that the activity stopped, but said it only sparked up when someone new would stay in the house or when they'd have a sitter at night. They said, since I knew the truth now, that they would pay me extra to come back because they could never keep a babysitter. Yeah, right, I thought. I'm never coming back here. But I said I'd be in touch, and I ran out of that house. I am ashamed to say I never answered their calls again. I felt bad, but there was no way in hell I'd ever return there. I still babysit once in a while, and I've never had an experience like that since. I still think of those kids sometimes, and I really think that Teddy was being affected by the spirit in the house. I've never encountered a child so cruel, so negative. Thinking of his little smile still sends chills down my back. I hope they were able to move or clear the negative energy. Either way, it's one night I won't ever forget. This is a personal experience that I had several years back, in either 2015 or 2016. At the time, I was working as a second shift mechanic at a trucking company 30 miles from where I lived. I became good friends with one of the mechanics on my shift, and we would often hang out after the shift ended. We both lived in the same town and would usually grab a case of beer on the way home, since gas stations were still open, close to midnight. There was a spot in the woods behind my house that I had turned into a fire pit, and on most occasions he would follow me home so we could drink there and not worry about bothering anybody in the late hour. One night after we punched off the time clock, we agreed to hang out like any other night. But this time he couldn't follow me home. I don't remember the reason since it was a while ago, but instead he could meet me at the church up the road from my house. I purchased the beer, get to the church parking lot, and wait for him to arrive. Now some time passes, and he is nowhere to be seen, so I figured I'd get out of my car and watch the road looking for headlights. I finally see his truck pull into the lot, and he pulls up beside my car, which I am leaning against. We decide to hang out at the church for a bit, before we depart to my place, both of us leaning against our vehicles facing the headstones. Now things get weird. We're talking, and then he cuts me off mid-sentence and says, "Do you see that?" "See what?" I said. He said he saw movement and points to a headstone several rows up from the curb of the parking lot. I focused in that direction for a moment, but honestly couldn't see whatever he had seen. He seemed very taken back by it, and I could tell he wasn't joking by his expression. I asked him what exactly it was he had seen, in which he replied, a dark shadow rocking back and forth. Whether I believed him fully or not, hearing his description gave me cold chills. I asked if he had a means of defense, and he showed the 9mm on his hip. Even still, he was in no way ready to walk up there and investigate the headstone. I decided to check it out and crossed the pavement and onto the grass. Now this church is pretty well lit by a half-dozen light poles, and the only shadows that were cast were by the headstones themselves. I start looking around on the third row, and I'm instantly hit with dread. About 15 feet in front of me is a pitch-black figure sitting against one of the stones. Its head was between its knees and was rocking steadily back and forth, exactly as my buddy had described. How he could have seen it from the car I do not know, but even worse to think about was that I had been alone with this thing and noticed the entire time. I ask if he or she is all right and get no response, only a faint whimpering, as if it was mourning the loss of whoever was buried at the grave. I figured grave visitations weren't unusual, but at midnight that's really eerie. I walk closely to the figure until I am standing 3 feet from it and was going to speak out again, until my blood runs absolutely cold. There is light illuminating onto the figure and somewhat of the surrounding ground, and unlike anything I have ever seen, the light seems to just absorb into the blackness of the figure. I could see no defining features, couldn't make out shoes, hair, or a hat. Separation of clothing telling me that this was a human being in my presence. The whimpering turned into louder, aggressive moans, and somehow keeping my military composure, I backed away slowly, then ran down to my buddy and told him we needed to get the hell out of there immediately. And we did. About an hour later we returned to the cemetery, but the figure was gone. We are no longer friends, but I still like to tell this story since it's my only real experience of the paranormal. Still, to this day, I have no idea what it was we saw that night. I honestly don't know how to tag this, but if this was anything, it might have been a demon. I've got no idea. Now, my parents had a friend who was a single mother of a child around my age, just a year older. Because of that, we obviously got to hang out together on multiple occasions for years on end. When we were around 7 or 8 years old, her mum let her have her first sleepover at my house. Everything was doing fine until the sun went down. We wanted to be up extra late, so we snuck out of my room to play some more after my parents had gone to bed. After a while of sneaking around, we decided we wanted to eat some cereal. I was going through a phase where all I wanted to eat was Captain Crunch. Like lots of families, we had our main fridge in our kitchen and another in our basement. At the time, our basement was unfinished. It was huge, almost the size of our whole house, with 3 concrete walls and one that was made up of huge grey bricks. Our laundry room was in the top right corner behind some wooden slat stairs and against the brick wall. The laundry room wasn't actually a laundry room though, just a corner with the washer, dryer and the extra fridge on a square of carpet we'd laid out so it was softer to stand on than the cold concrete floor. I was naturally terrified of the basement as a child, because the corner underneath our wooden stairs had just a single light bulb hanging freely over the laundry room. The brick wall, which was to the right of the laundry appliances, also had a few bricks missing up by the exposed ceiling, with all the creepy tubes and pink fluffy insulation. There was a crawl space on the other side of the brick wall. Nothing really interesting, and I wasn't tall enough to see over it, but that didn't stop my child brain from imagining stuff on the other side. Obviously, I didn't go down there for my irrational fear of the creepy basement. So of course, we opened the main fridge upstairs and realized that we have no milk. My friend insists that she has to have cereal and that we should check the downstairs fridge. Immediately I affirmed that there was no way I was going down there, especially this late at night, and it was just the two of us. Somehow, though, she convinced me, and soon we were creeping down the steps. We had turned on the switch, but it was still so dark since the only light was above the laundry corner, which was conveniently behind the staircase we walked down, lighting the way through the gaps in the steps. Once we got down there, I felt braver than ever. I got that childlike surge of adrenaline, and I thought I was the toughest kid ever. I think my friend felt the same way, because as soon as we turned around and got to the laundry corner, we started sizing up the room in a "that wasn't so bad" kind of way. I continue walking to the fridge on the far left to get some milk, and she keeps standing there. At some point between my walk from the start of the carpet to the fridge, she had seen an old pile of toys we kept down in the bottom right corner, straight ahead from the top right corner we were in. I had just opened the fridge door when I hear her start to scream. I turn around and she's standing directly across from me. Her mouth is wide open, her eyes slightly raised up and shaking, and she's doing what looks like high knees in place as she flaps her arms around. It was pure fear. I scream because she is, and we're both up the stairs like darts. As soon as we get to the living room, she throws herself belly down on the floor and starts kicking like a mad woman. My parents come running, of course, and think she's having a seizure on the floor. When they scoop her up, they realize that's not the case, and she just starts sobbing. They ask her what's wrong, what hurts, etc. I'm just standing there staring at her with tears streaming down my face. I've never seen someone that terrified in my life, even to this day, not even in horror movies. They couldn't get any response besides hysterical mumblings of "there was a man in a hat," until she finally calmed down just to crying. Her mom came and picked her up, and my dad went searching around the basement for some man with a hat. I got a stern talking to for staying up past bedtime, and that was that. I was put back in my room, but I slept with the lights on that night. I didn't see her ever again after that, at least not until years and years later, and when I did talk to her, she came up on Facebook. I found out she had been in and out of mental hospitals for years since. I've had a specific experience in that same house that makes me feel like she isn't crazy, but that thing made her crazy. We moved a few years after we had fully renovated the house, and I haven't been there since, but I did see him myself. A fedora tipped down so you couldn't see his face, a long trench coat, and what looked like dog-like paws with long claws, which sounds really, really strange. Just typing it out makes me think I might be insane too. I was around the age of 11 when I went on a field trip with my 5th grade class to an abandoned old-timey school ground. We were mainly there so the teachers could show how lucky we were to have the kind of schools we have now. The school was pretty broken down, with a few of the windows cracked and floorboards moulded over. We weren't allowed to touch anything unless the teachers told us explicitly that we could, for obvious safety reasons. There was a pretty large yard surrounding the building's east side, with large crooked trees thriving all over the area, and about 3 hours into the event, we were given a 45-minute-long lunch break to eat in the yard. After eating, which only took about 10 minutes, me and my small group of friends decided to wander around the place, looking for anything that could amuse our naive minds. We walked for a while, climbing up trees and goofing around, until we came across an incredibly old and withered oak tree. The bark was a charcoal grey, with flakes torn off in seemingly random areas around the trunk, exposing the wood and various species of insects writhing around. As we walked up to it, we noticed a strange object near the base of the tree. It wasn't long until we could make out the light orange fur, black skin, and blood of a severed arm. We all jumped back in unison at the sight before slowly creeping back towards the tree to examine it further. The arm was only the size of a shoe, and definitely belonged to an animal of some sort, having an opposable thumb, dark-skinned palm, and short hair around the entirety of the limb, which only consisted of the forearm and elbow joint which was exposed. We stood there staring at it for God knows how long, with horrified faces, until one of our teachers saw us and quickly ushered us away before looking back with a puzzled look on her face. When I asked her what it was, she dismissed it as belonging to a squirrel, but I know what I saw. Squirrels don't have opposable thumbs, and they sure as hell don't have foot-long forearms. That was something else entirely. I sat alone on the bus on the way back, piecing together the evidence of what happened to try to find some kind of answer as to what the animal was and how it lost its arm. But with no luck. I was a huge animal enthusiast back then, and I still couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. Nor can I as of today. This event occurred in Oklahoma, for those of you who may be curious. Now, I'm not trying to say I found a new animal or anything of the sort, but I can say that I do not know of any animal alive today that could have logically been in the area we were. Hey fearsome friends, thanks for listening. Please make sure you subscribe and click that notification button so you can be aware of all my videos when they upload. If you have a story that you'd like to hear me record, then please send it to my subreddit, rmissfearsome83, or alternatively email me at missfearsome83@hotmail.com. If you'd also like to support me further, please go to my Patreon and join for as little as $1 a month, where you'll get early access to all my recordings, and they will also be available as MP3 downloads. I also have some awesome merch on the Spreadshirt website. All links are in the description below. Stay safe, stay happy, and remember, keep being creepy.